He sat at the head of the table for 3 hours, drinking whiskey, while the entire city's elite called his wife a cheater. Not a single word. Not a single defense. Everyone thought Aaron Blackwood was a broken billionaire, too weak to face the truth that his wife, Paige, was sleeping with his business partner. The room mocked him. His wife took off her wedding ring in tears, begging for a divorce just to spare him the shame. But they were all wrong. Aaron wasn't silent because he was defeated. He was silent because he was watching a timer on his phone count down to midnight. And when that clock struck 0, he didn't scream. He simply locked the doors and turned the glass walls into giant screens, showing the terrified guests exactly who the real traitor was. You need to see how the most satisfying revenge is the one served in total silence. The rain in Seattle did not fall like ordinary rain that night. It slammed against the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of the Blackwood estate with the rhythmic violence of a drum, demanding to be let in. Perched precariously on the edge of a cliff overlooking the churning Pacific Ocean, the mansion was known to the architectural world as the Prism. It was Aaron Blackwood's masterpiece, a structure of steel and glass that seemed to defy gravity, suspending its inhabitants over the abyss. Tonight, however, it felt less like a home and more like a beautifully illuminated cage. Paige Hollister stepped out of the Blacktown car and felt the wind bite through the silk of her white gown. She did not run for the cover of the portico. She took a single breath of the freezing, salt-laden air, grounding herself before she had to face the suffocating warmth inside. This was the night of the gala, a celebration of Aaron's newest skyscraper, the Obsidian Tower, but Paige knew the truth. This was not a celebration. It was a trial, and she was the defendant who had already been found guilty in the court of public opinion. She handed her coat to the valet, who refused to meet her eyes. It started already. The silence. The averted gazes. Paige straightened her spine. She was an engineer, a woman who understood the physics of pressure and resistance. She knew that if a structure was too rigid, it would snap in a storm, so she forced her body to relax, to flow with the tension rather than fight it. She pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped into the grand foyer. The noise of the party died instantly. 150 of Seattle's wealthiest investors, critics, and socialites were gathered in the main atrium. Crystal flutes of champagne froze in midair. Conversations were severed mid-sentence. The silence that descended was heavy, physical, and suffocating. It rushed into Paige's ears, drowning out the sound of the rain outside. She stood alone at the top of the marble staircase, looking down at the sea of black tuxedos and designer dresses. She felt exposed, a singular drop of white ink in a pool of dark oil. They were looking at her. She could feel their judgment crawling over her skin. They were whispering the stories that Roman Steele had planted in the tabloids. They whispered that she was the ungrateful wife who had sold her husband's genius secrets to his rivals. They whispered that she had warmed Roman's bed to secure funding for her own vanity projects. They looked at her and saw a traitor. Paige descended the stairs. Each step clicked sharply against the marble, echoing in the cavernous room. She kept her chin high, her face a mask of porcelain indifference. Inside, she was screaming. She wanted to shout at them that they knew nothing of sacrifice. She wanted to tell them that the man they admired, Aaron Blackwood, was in danger, and she was the only one standing between him and federal prison. But she could not. Silence was the only shield she had left. At the bottom of the stairs, the crowd parted. It was not a gesture of respect. It was an act of quarantine. They drew back as if she were contagious, leaving a wide, empty path through the center of the room. And at the end of that path, standing before the colossal window that looked out into the black void of the ocean, was her husband. Aaron Blackwood did not turn around. He stood with his back to the room, a silhouette of sharp angles and broad shoulders cut from the darkness. He wore a tuxedo that fit him like armor. One hand was in his pocket, the other held a tumbler of whiskey, the amber liquid untouched. He was staring at his own reflection in the glass, and through it, at the storm raging outside. Paige stopped 10 feet away from him. The distance felt like miles. This was the most painful part of the charade. For 7 years, Aaron had been her gravity. When she walked into a room, he would usually turn to her, as if sensing a shift in the magnetic field. He would offer his hand, his eyes softening only for her. Tonight, he was a statue. By refusing to acknowledge her, Aaron was confirming the rumors to everyone in the room. His coldness was the final piece of evidence the crowd needed. They saw a husband scorned, a genius broken by his wife's infidelity. They pitied him, and that pity fueled their hatred for her. Aaron, Paige whispered. The name barely left her lips. He did not move. He did not flinch. He simply took a slow sip of his whiskey, his eyes fixed on the horizon. To the onlookers, it was a deliberate snub. To Paige, who knew the cadence of his breathing and the tension in his jaw, it was something else. It was restraint. He was vibrating with a contained energy that terrified her. Was it anger? Was it hate? Or was he playing his part in this terrible play too well? A woman in a red velvet dress, the wife of a prominent banker, leaned toward her husband, her voice pitched just loud enough for Paige to hear. I cannot believe she actually showed her face. If I had done what she did to a man like Aaron, I would have left the country. Shameless, the banker muttered, shaking his head. Look at him. He cannot even bear to look at her. The structure of that marriage is as cracked as the foundation she tried to ruin. The words hit Paige like physical blows, but she did not flinch. She had anticipated this. She had analyzed the load-bearing capacity of her own heart and decided it could hold the weight. She had to. If she broke now, if she ran away or cried, Roman Steele would win. Roman was watching. She knew he was. He was somewhere in this room, swirling his wine, checking his watch, waiting for her to crumble so he could step in as the consoling hero and finalize his hostile takeover of Aaron's company. Paige moved to the side, retreating to the shadow of a large marble pillar. She needed to be invisible, yet she was the center of attention. She watched Aaron's back, her heart aching with a profound loneliness. She remembered the day they built this house. They had sat on the bare concrete foundation, eating takeout noodles, dreaming of a house made of glass so they could always see the truth. No secrets, Aaron had said then, kissing her temple. We build with clear lines. No hidden walls. The irony tasted like ash in her mouth. Their entire lives had become a hidden wall. She had lied to him for 3 months, stealing files, meeting Roman in secret, recording conversations, all to prove that the steel Roman was supplying for the obsidian tower was faulty. She had to become the villain to save his masterpiece from collapsing. But looking at Aaron's rigid posture, she feared she had saved the building only to destroy the architect. The atmosphere in the room grew louder as the guests realized Aaron was not going to make a scene immediately. They grew bolder. Laughter returned, sharp and brittle. The clinking of glasses resumed, sounding like the racking of tiny slides on pistols. Paige stood alone, gripping her clutch so tightly her knuckles turned white. She felt the vibration of the floor beneath her feet as the thunder rolled again, shaking the glass walls. She was the structural engineer. She knew how to calculate the breaking point of steel, concrete, and glass. But as she stood in the cold shadow of her husband's silence, surrounded by 100 pairs of eyes waiting for her execution, Paige Hollister realized she had no formula for calculating the breaking point of a human soul. She was holding up the weight of the sky, and tonight, she was terrified that she was finally going to collapse. The waiters moved through the crowded atrium like sharks gliding through deep water, their movements silent and predatory, holding silver trays laden with flute glasses that caught the fracture of light from the crystal chandeliers overhead. The air in the room was thick, not just with the scent of expensive perfume and aged scotch, but with the palpable viscosity of scandal. It clung to the velvet curtains and settled heavily on the shoulders of every guest, but nowhere did it press down harder than on Paige Hollister. She remained in the shadow of the marble pillar, a statue of forced composure, watching the room spin around her. Every laugh felt sharp, every whisper sounded like the hissing of steam escaping a pressurized pipe. She took a sip of champagne, but the liquid tasted metallic, like holding a penny under her tongue. From the periphery of her vision, she saw him detach himself from a circle of laughing investors. Roman Steele. He did not walk so much as prowl, his movement fluid and confident, possessing the easy grace of a man who believes he owns the ground beneath his feet. He wore a midnight blue tuxedo that cost more than most people earned in a year, the fabric shimmering slightly under the lights. To the uninformed eye, he was the picture of modern success, handsome in a rugged, approachable way, with a smile that could disarm a boardroom. But Paige knew the rot that lived beneath that veneer. She knew that his charm was nothing more than the painted drywall covering a structure eaten away by termites. He was coming straight for her. Paige's instinct was to run, to turn and flee into the storm outside, but her feet felt welded to the floor. She could not cause a scene. A scene would be headlines. A scene would be the final nail in the coffin Roman had built for Aaron's reputation. So she stood her ground, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass until she feared it might snap and slice into her palm. Roman stopped just inside her personal space, close enough that she could smell his cologne, a musk of sandalwood and arrogance that made her stomach turn. To the room, he looked like a concerned friend approaching a distressed woman. He tilted his head, his expression a masterpiece of faux sympathy. "You look tense, Paige," Roman said, his voice a low, smooth baritone that didn't carry beyond the two of them. "You should try the caviar. It's excellent tonight." Aaron really spared no expense for his funeral. Paige stared at him, her eyes cold. "It is not a funeral, Roman. It is a launch party. Is there a difference?" Roman swirled the wine in his glass, taking a slow, deliberate sip while his eyes scanned the room, landing on the backs of the whispering guests. "Look at them. They're vultures. They smell blood in the water. They know the obsidian tower is a disaster waiting to happen, and they know who to blame." He turned his gaze back to her, and the warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by a flat, dead shark-like stare. "You've done well, Paige. You've played your part perfectly. Everyone here thinks you're the villain. It makes it so much easier for me to be the hero who sweeps in to save the company from Aaron's incompetence and his wife's indiscretions." "I haven't done this for you," Paige hissed, her voice barely a breath. "I did it to stop you from sending him to prison for a crime you committed." Roman chuckled softly, stepping closer. He reached out and brushed a speck of imaginary lint from her bare shoulder. His fingers were cold, and the touch burned her skin like dry ice. Paige flinched internally, every nerve ending screaming in protest, but she forced herself to remain still. From across the room, the gesture looked intimate, familiar. It was a visual confirmation to every watching eye that the rumors were true, that the wife of the architect was indeed comfortable in the hands of the developer. "Smile, darling," Roman whispered, his hand lingering on her arm just a second too long. "If you look terrified, they might start to wonder. But if you look guilty, if you look like a woman caught between two lovers, then they'll believe everything I've fed them. They love a tragedy. They love to see a great man fall because of a woman's weakness." Paige felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. She looked past Roman, her eyes seeking out the only anchor she had left. Aaron was still standing by the colossal window, his back to the room. The storm outside had intensified, the rain lashing against the glass in sheets of gray fury. In the dark reflection of the window, she could see him, and she knew, with a jolt of terrifying clarity, that he could see her. He was watching the reflection. He saw Roman standing close to her. He saw Roman's hand on her arm. He saw the intimacy of their proximity. And he did nothing. Aaron's reflection was a ghost in the glass, unmoving, unreadable. He did not turn around to defend her honor. He did not march across the room to punch Roman in the jaw. He simply took another sip of his whiskey. The passivity was agonizing. It felt like a betrayal deeper than any shout could have been. Did he believe it? After all the years of building a life together, of understanding the silent language of each other's souls, did he truly believe she was capable of this? Or was he so defeated by the structural failure of his business that he no longer had the energy to fight for his wife? "He's not going to save you," Roman said, following her gaze to the window. He leaned in, his lips brushing her ear. "He's weak, Paige. A visionary, sure. But visionaries shatter when the real world hits them. He knows he's lost. He knows you're mine. That's why he can't look at you. Shame is a powerful silencer. He is twice the man you will ever be. Paige whispered, though her voice trembled. He builds things that last. You only know how to tear them down. I know how to sell them, Roman corrected, stepping back and buttoning his jacket. And by tomorrow morning, when the board votes to remove him and install me as CEO to handle the crisis you caused, I'll be the one selling the Obsidian Tower. And you? You'll be the disgraced ex-wife with a nice settlement, provided you keep your mouth shut about the steal. He raised his glass in a mock toast, his smile widening to reveal perfect, predatory teeth. To structural integrity, Paige. May the best foundation win. He walked away, leaving her trembling in his wake. The space he left behind felt cold and empty. Paige leaned back against the pillar, her legs feeling like water. She scanned the room again. The whispers had grown louder. The eyes were sharper. She saw the smirk on the face of a rival architect. She saw the pity in the eyes of an old friend who quickly looked away. They had seen the interaction. They had seen Roman's hand on her skin. The verdict was in. She looked back at the window. Aaron had finally moved. He had placed his forehead against the cold glass, closing his eyes. He looked exhausted, a man carrying the weight of a collapsing skyscraper on his shoulders. Paige wanted to run to him, to press her hands against his back and tell him that the steal was bad, that Roman had faked the invoices, that she loved him more than her own dignity. But she couldn't. Roman had the leverage. One word from her, and the evidence of embezzlement, planted by Roman on Aaron's private server, would go to the FBI. She was trapped in a glass house, and the walls were closing in. The storm outside was nothing compared to the hurricane destroying her life from the inside out. She took a deep breath, fighting back the tears that threatened to ruin her makeup. She had to be strong. She had to be the steel beam that didn't bend, even when the fire was hottest. But as she watched a group of gossip columnists glancing in her direction, notebooks in hand, she wondered how much longer she could hold up the roof before the whole world came crashing down. The architecture of a rumor is much like the architecture of a skyscraper. It requires a foundation of truth, however small, upon which to build a towering structure of lies. In the center of the atrium, near a sculpture of twisted bronze that looked suspiciously like a serpent eating its own tail, stood a cluster of people who specialized in such construction. They were the city's most vicious gossip columnists and social critics, holding their recorders like daggers, their voices pitched to a frequency that cut through the ambient noise of the jazz quartet. Paige could not help but hear them. It was as if the acoustics of the glass house had been designed to funnel their cruelty directly to her ears. It is not just about the infidelity, a woman with a sharp, avian face was saying, her lips pursed around the rim of her glass. She was a writer for the city's leading society page, a woman who could end a career with a single adjective. Cheating is banal. Everyone in this room has cheated or been cheated on. No, what Paige did is far more unforgivable. She committed industrial espionage against her own husband. I heard from a very reliable source at the firm that she leaked the seismic stability algorithms for the Obsidian Tower to Roman Steel's engineers weeks ago. And in exchange for what? A man asked, laughing softly. A weekend in Aspen? I saw the flight logs, you know. Private jet. Just the two of them. While Aaron was in Tokyo trying to secure the Japanese investors, his wife was drinking hot cocoa in a chalet with his CFO. It makes sense, the woman continued, her eyes darting toward where Paige stood in the shadows. She's an engineer, but she's always been in Aaron's shadow. Perhaps she got tired of being the muse and decided to cash in on the genius. It is pathetic, really, destroying a legacy for a little bit of attention. Paige felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her lightheaded. The grip on her clutch tightened until her knuckles ached. Aspen. The lie was so precise, so detailed. She remembered that weekend vividly, but there had been no chalet, no hot cocoa, and certainly no romance. The memory washed over her, violent and cold, pulling her away from the glittering party and dragging her back into the gray nightmare of 3 months ago. The flashback hit her with the force of a physical blow. She was back in Roman Steel's office, a space of chrome and leather that smelled of stale espresso and aggressive ambition. It was raining that day, too. Roman had called her in for an emergency meeting regarding the tower's supply chain. When she arrived, There were no other executives, no lawyers. Just Roman, sitting behind his desk, and a single tablet computer sliding across the polished mahogany surface toward her. "What is this?" she had asked, her voice steady, though a prickle of unease had already started to crawl up her spine. "The invoice for the steel columns on floors 40 through 60, Roman had replied, his voice terrifyingly casual. "And the independent stress test results I just received." Paige had picked up the tablet, her engineer's eyes scanning the data. Her breath had hitched. The numbers were wrong. The tensile strength of the steel listed was 40% lower than what Aaron's design required. If they built the tower with this material, it wouldn't just be weak, it would be a death trap. A minor earthquake, a high wind storm, like the one battering the house tonight, would shear the bolts and bring the entire structure down. This is negligence," she had stammered, looking up at him in horror. "We have to stop construction. We have to rip it out. Who authorized this purchase? Who signed off on this cheap substitute?" Roman had smiled then, a slow, reptilian stretching of his lips. He tapped the screen. "Look at the digital signature at the bottom, Paige." She looked, and her heart stopped. There, in the sharp pixels of the screen, was Aaron's signature. "It is a forgery," she had whispered, shaking her head. "Aaron would never. He is obsessed with safety. He would never compromise the integrity of the tower to save money." "But the board doesn't know that," Roman said, leaning back, lacing his fingers behind his head. "And the FBI certainly won't know that. You see, I've already routed the savings from this purchase, about $12 million, into an offshore account linked to Aaron's name. If this comes out, it looks exactly like what it is. The arrogant architect skimming off the top, risking thousands of lives to line his own pockets." "You did this," she accused, rising to her feet, fury replacing her shock. "You framed him." "I did," Roman admitted freely, without a shred of remorse. "And I have the evidence to prove it. Encrypted, hidden, and set to delete itself if I don't enter a code every 24 hours. But if you go to Aaron, if you go to the police, I will release the files that implicate him. He will go to federal prison for fraud and reckless endangerment. His legacy will be ash. The Obsidian Tower will be known as his tombstone." "What do you want?" she had asked, realizing with sickening clarity that she was trapped. "I want the company," Roman had said. "I want full control. And to get that, I need the board to lose faith in Aaron. I need him distracted, broken, and isolated. That is where you come in, my dear. You are going to be the distraction. You are going to let the world believe you are betraying him. You will be seen with me. You will let the rumors fly. You will break his heart so thoroughly that he loses his focus, and when he starts missing deadlines and making mistakes, the board will hand the keys to me." "I won't do it," she had said, tears stinging her eyes. "Then say goodbye to your husband," Roman had replied, reaching for the phone. "I have the FBI on speed dial." The memory faded, leaving Paige breathless in the present day. The jazz music seemed too loud, the laughter too shrill. She had made her choice in that office. She had chosen to murder her own reputation to save Aaron's life. She had let Roman fabricate the Aspen trip receipts. She had let him leak the fake story about the stolen blueprints. She had endured 3 months of Aaron's growing coldness, his silent confusion, and finally, his utter detachment, all because she couldn't tell him the truth without triggering the trap. She looked across the room at Aaron again. He was still staring at the window, a man carved from ice. Does he know? She wondered, a fresh wave of despair crashing over her. Does he believe the lies like everyone else? Of course he did. Why wouldn't he? She had played her part perfectly. She had been the villain he needed her to be, so that Roman wouldn't destroy him. But the cost was unbearable. She was saving the architect, but she was destroying the marriage that was the foundation of her own life. "Look at her face." The gossip columnist's voice cut through the air again, pulling Paige back to the brutal reality of the gala. "She looks like she's about to faint. Guilt is a heavy burden, isn't it? Or maybe she's just realized that Roman is done with her," the man replied with a sneer. "Once a cheater, always a liability. She sold out a genius for a shark, and now she's realizing that sharks eat their own." Paige felt a tear slip free, hot and humiliating against her cold cheek. She quickly wiped it away, but she knew they had seen it. They were feeding on her pain. She took a step back, retreating further into the shadows, wishing the floor would open up and swallow her whole. She had analyzed the blueprints of this betrayal 1,000 times, looking for an escape route, a structural weakness in Roman's plan, but she had found nothing. She was the load-bearing wall that had to crumble so the rest of the building could stand. And as she watched Aaron's rigid back, she realized the terrifying truth. The building was standing, but the home inside it was already gone. To understand the magnitude of the silence currently suffocating the grand atrium of the Blackwood estate, one first had to understand the noise that used to fill the space between Aaron and Paige. Their marriage had never been a quiet one, nor had it been the polite, sterile union of convenience that the whispering guests assumed. It had been a collision of forces, a constant, electrifying dialogue between the impossible and the inevitable. If Aaron was the storm that dreamed of skyscrapers piercing the clouds, Paige was the earth that held them steady against the wind. Standing in the shadow of the marble pillar, Paige allowed herself to close her eyes for a fleeting second, escaping the hostile glare of the chandeliers to retreat into a memory from 2 years ago. It was the night the Obsidian Tower was born. They had been in Aaron's private studio, a chaotic sanctuary of crumpled drafting paper and balsa wood models. It was 3 in the morning, and the city of Seattle slept beneath a blanket of fog. But inside the studio, the air was vibrating with the frantic energy of creation. Aaron had been pacing, his hair disheveled, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms dusted with charcoal. He was sketching in the air with his hands, describing a building that twisted as it rose, a structure that looked like a shard of black volcanic glass erupting from the pavement. "It needs to look dangerous," he had said, his eyes burning with that terrifying, beautiful intensity that made Paige fall in love with him. "It needs to look like it is defying physics, Paige. I want people to look at it and feel vertigo. I want them to question gravity." Paige had sat on the floor, surrounded by his discarded sketches, a calculator and a tablet in her lap. She was the only person in the world allowed in this room when he was in this state. To everyone else, Aaron Blackwood was the intimidating, silent genius. To her, he was a man trying to catch lightning in a bottle. "Gravity is not a suggestion, Aaron," she had replied softly, tracing the line of his proposed cantilever. "It is the law. If you twist the frame at this angle, the torque on the central core will snap the spine of the building before you even reach the 50th floor." Aaron had stopped pacing. He dropped to his knees in front of her, ignoring the charcoal dust on the floor, and grabbed her hands. His grip was warm, solid, and desperate. "Then fix it," he had whispered, pressing his forehead against hers. "I dream the impossible, Paige. You make it stand up. That is the deal. That is the design." Calculated stress, she had murmured, a term from her engineering textbooks. "We channel the pressure. We do not fight the weight. We redistribute it. We make the tension part of the strength." He had kissed her then, a kiss that tasted of coffee and exhaustion and absolute trust. "You are my keystone," he had said against her lips. "Without you, I am just a man drawing pretty pictures that will fall down in the wind." The memory dissolved, replaced by the cold, sharp reality of the gala. Paige opened her eyes and felt a physical ache in her chest, as if a rib had cracked. The irony was bitter enough to choke on. She was still doing exactly what he had asked of her that night. She was practicing calculated stress. She was redistributing the crushing weight of Roman Steele's blackmail, absorbing the tension, taking the full load of the scandal onto her own shoulders so that Aaron would not break. She was making herself the point of failure so that the rest of his life, his company, his reputation, his freedom, could remain standing. But Aaron did not know that. Across the room, the waiters began to circulate with the main course, plates of seared scallops and truffle risotto that smelled rich and earthy. The clinking of silverware against fine china rose in a cacophony that sounded like the distant dismantling of a machine. Paige watched Aaron. He had moved away from the window, but remained isolated, standing near the bar. He had not eaten. He had not spoken to a single soul. He looked like a building that had been condemned, vacant, dark, and waiting for the wrecking ball. He believes I am the storm that ruined him, Paige thought, the despair rising in her throat like bile. He thinks I broke the deal. He thinks I took the foundation we built and sold it for parts. The thought was interrupted by a sharp, ringing sound. In the center of the room, standing on a raised platform usually reserved for the orchestra conductor, Roman Steele was tapping a silver spoon against his champagne flute. The sound cut through the ambient noise like a sniper's bullet. The room fell silent instantly. Faces turned toward him, eager and expectant. They knew the dynamic at play. They knew that with Aaron incapacitated by humiliation, Roman was the de facto king of the evening. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, Roman began, his voice amplified by the acoustics of the glass room. He smiled, a dazzling expression that did not reach his predatory eyes. Thank you for braving this terrible weather to join us tonight. I know the storm outside is fierce, but inside, we are safe. We are protected by the vision of Blackwood Architects. A ripple of polite, uncomfortable applause moved through the crowd. Roman raised a hand, silencing them with the benevolent air of a dictator. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of the Obsidian Tower, Roman continued, pacing slightly on the platform, his gaze sweeping the room before landing heavily on Aaron. And it still is. But it is also a night of reflection. We often forget that great buildings are not just made of steel and glass. They are made of trust. They are made of partnerships that must endure even the harshest conditions. Paige felt her stomach lurch. The double meaning was blatant, a knife twisted slowly in the wound. Roman was publicly mocking the disintegration of Aaron's marriage while pretending to praise the resilience of the company. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. There have been challenges recently, Roman said, his voice dropping to a solemn, confidential register. He turned his body slightly so that he was facing Paige, though he did not address her by name. There have been tremors in the bedrock, rumors, difficulties, but I want to assure everyone in this room that the Obsidian Tower will rise. I have personally stepped in to ensure that the structural integrity of this project is maintained, regardless of the personal failures of those involved. The room gasped softly. It was a direct attack. He was calling Paige a failure in front of the entire city elite, and he was declaring Aaron incompetent in the same breath. So, Roman raised his glass high, the golden liquid catching the light. I would like to propose a toast. To strength. To the ability to recognize when a component is weak and the wisdom to replace it before the whole structure falls. To the future of Blackwood Architects, under new, stable guidance. Cheers. Cheers, the crowd echoed, though the response was ragged. Many people glanced nervously at Aaron, waiting for the explosion. Paige held her breath. She looked at her husband. This was it. No man could withstand such a public emasculation. Aaron had to react. He had to scream, to throw his glass, to storm out. But Aaron did nothing. He stood perfectly still, his hand wrapped around his whiskey tumbler. His face was a mask of terrifying neutrality. He did not drink the toast. He did not look at Roman. He simply stared at the liquid in his glass, as if reading a message in the amber depths. To the room, his silence was the ultimate admission of defeat. It was the silence of a man who had been beaten into submission. But Paige, watching him with the desperate intensity of a woman looking for a lifeline, saw something else. She saw a tiny, rhythmic pulse in his jaw. She saw the way the tendons in his hand stood out in sharp relief, white against the tense skin. He was not relaxed. He was under immense tension. He was like a steel cable stretched to its absolute limit, humming with a frequency that was too high for human ears to hear. Why are you waiting? She pleaded silently. Why are you letting him do this to you? And then, a terrifying thought occurred to her. Perhaps he was not waiting. Perhaps he was already broken. Perhaps the load she had been trying to carry for him had been too heavy all along, and despite her sacrifice, the sheer weight of the betrayal, the belief that his wife and his best friend had conspired against him, had crushed the spirit of the man who once dreamed of defying gravity. The realization brought a wave of dizziness so strong that Paige had to reach out and steady herself against the cold marble pillar. She had calculated the stress on the building, but she had failed to calculate the stress on the heart. She had thought she could save him by becoming the villain, but she had not realized that by destroying his trust in her, she might have destroyed the very thing that kept him upright. Roman stepped down from the platform, beaming, accepting handshakes and pats on the back from the fickle crowd who were all too eager to align themselves with the winner. The noise of the party resumed, louder and more frantic than before. Paige felt a sudden, suffocating need for air. She could not stand here anymore. She could not watch Roman parade his victory while Aaron stood like a ghost in his own home. The pressure inside her had exceeded the safety factor. The warning lights were flashing red. She needed to end this. She needed to confess, to scream the truth, to sign the papers, to do whatever it took to stop the torture. She pushed herself away from the pillar. Her legs were trembling, but her resolve was hardening into something brittle and sharp. She would not let the night end like this. If the building was going to fall, she would be the one to detonate the charges, not Roman steel. The dinner was served with the precision of a military operation, a parade of servers placing porcelain plates upon the long glass table in perfect unison. The main course was a delicate filet mignon, seared to perfection, but to Paige Hollister, the aroma of roasted meat and red wine was nauseating. It smelled like blood and excess. She sat at the far end of the table, exiled to the fringes of her own home, while Aaron occupied the head seat, a king presiding over the dissolution of his own kingdom. The storm outside had not relented. If anything, it had grown more violent, the wind howling around the corners of the cliffside glass house like a pack of wolves trying to find a way in. The seating arrangement, manipulated by Roman Steele's assistants earlier that day, placed Roman directly to Aaron's right, the position of the trusted advisor, the right-hand man. It was a visual usurpation of power that everyone in the room understood. Paige watched as Roman charmed the board members sitting near him, his laughter booming too loudly, his gestures expansive. He was eating with gusto, cutting into the steak with a sharpness that suggested he was imagining it was Aaron's heart. Aaron, by contrast, had not touched his silverware. He sat with his hands resting flat on the table, staring straight ahead. To the guests, he appeared catatonic, a man paralyzed by the shame of his wife's public betrayal. But Paige, watching him from down the table, saw the tension in his shoulders. She saw the way his eyes tracked the reflection of the room in the dark window panes. He was present, painfully so, but he was locked inside a fortress of silence that she could no longer breach. The conversation around the table was a low hum of gossip, but as the wine flowed, the voices grew bolder. The guests were losing their fear of Aaron. They were beginning to treat him not as a volatile genius, but as a curiosity, a fallen idol. "It is a tragedy, really," a woman across from Paige whispered to her neighbor, making no effort to lower her voice. She wore diamonds that caught the candlelight, cold and sharp. "The firm has been bleeding money since the rumors started. I heard the banks are calling in the loans on the Obsidian Tower tomorrow. If Roman doesn't take over, the whole thing goes into receivership. And she just sits there," the neighbor replied, glancing at Paige with a mixture of disgust and fascination. "If I were her, I would have had the decency to disappear. Does she enjoy watching him suffer?" Paige stared at her plate, her vision blurring. They thought she was staying out of spite. They thought she was clinging to her position like a parasite. They didn't know that every second she sat in this chair, enduring their scorn, was a second bought for Aaron's survival. She was waiting for the signal, any signal, that the trap had sprung, that the evidence against Roman was secure. But the night was dragging on, and Roman was only growing stronger. Roman suddenly leaned forward, tapping his knife against his wine glass. The sharp ting-ting-ting cut through the murmur of the room. He didn't stand this time. He remained seated, lounging back with the arrogant comfort of a man who knows he has already won. "Aaron," Roman said, his voice smooth and conversational, yet loud enough to carry to every corner of the dining room. "I was just telling the board about our new direction. Once the restructuring is complete, I think we should rebrand. Blackwood Architects feels a bit dated, doesn't it? Given the circumstances. We need a name that represents stability, trust, something that doesn't remind the public of recent structural failures." The insult hung in the air, heavy and toxic. He was talking about erasing Aaron's name from his own creation. He was talking about burying him while he was still sitting at the table. Aaron did not blink. He did not turn his head. He simply breathed, a slow, controlled intake of air. And Paige, Roman continued, turning his gaze down the table to where she sat. The predator's smile was back. We need to discuss the settlement. I have the papers in my car. I think it would be best for everyone if we expedited the divorce. Aaron needs a clean slate to rebuild his credit. You understand, don't you? It is the least you can do after everything. The room went dead silent. This was the kill shot. Roman was publicly demanding she release her husband, framing it as an act of mercy. He was forcing her hand. If she refused, she looked like a monster keeping Aaron trapped. If she agreed, she gave Roman exactly what he wanted. Aaron, broken and alone, with no one left to watch his back. Something inside Paige finally snapped. It wasn't a loud break. It was the quiet, terrifying sound of a load-bearing beam giving way under too much weight. She looked at Aaron. He was still looking at the window. He wouldn't look at her. He wouldn't fight for her. And perhaps, she realized with a jolt of agonizing heartbreak, he shouldn't. Maybe Roman was right about one thing. Maybe her presence was only hurting him now. She had tried to save him by playing the villain, but perhaps she had played the role too well. She had become the toxicity in his life. The evidence wasn't ready. The trap hadn't worked. She had failed. And the only way to save him from further humiliation was to remove herself from the equation entirely. Paige pushed her chair back. The sound of the legs scraping against the marble floor was harsh and jarring, like a scream in the silence. Every head turned toward her. She stood up, her legs trembling beneath the silk of her gown. She felt lightheaded, as if the air in the room had been sucked out. She looked down the long table at Roman, meeting his eyes. He looked delighted. He thought he had broken her. And he had. You are right, Roman, Paige said. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear, trembling with a raw, brittle emotion that stunned the room. Aaron needs a clean slate. She turned her gaze to her husband. For the first time all night, Aaron's eyes flickered. He shifted slightly in his chair, his hand tightening around his glass until his knuckles turned white. But he still did not look at her. I never wanted the money, Paige said, her voice cracking slightly. She wasn't speaking to the crowd anymore. She was speaking to the back of Aaron's head. I never wanted the fame. I only wanted to build something that would last. I wanted to be the one thing in your life that didn't have a breaking point. She reached for her left hand. Her fingers found the cold metal of her wedding ring. It was a custom design, of course. Aaron had drawn it on a napkin on their first date. It was a band of platinum with a tension-set diamond, held in place not by prongs, but by the sheer pressure of the metal. Pressure creates diamonds, he had told her. Pressure holds us together. Now, the pressure was tearing them apart. Paige twisted the ring. It resisted, as if it belonged on her finger, as if it were a part of her own bone structure. But she pulled, forcing it over the knuckle. The friction burned her skin. I am sorry, Aaron, she whispered, the tears finally spilling over, hot and fast. I am so sorry I couldn't hold it up. With a final, wrenching tug, the ring came free. Her hand felt suddenly naked, weightless, and wrong. She placed the ring on the glass table. She didn't set it down gently. She let it drop. The sound was shockingly loud. The heavy platinum band hit the glass, spun on its edge, and then settled with a final, hollow clatter. It sounded like a gavel coming down. It sounded like the end of the world. Give him the papers, Roman, Paige said, her voice hollow, devoid of fight. I will sign them. I will leave. Just let him build. That is all he has left. She stepped away from the table, swaying slightly. She couldn't breathe. She needed to get out. She needed to find a dark corner where she could curl up and die, because walking away from Aaron Blackwood felt like walking off the edge of the cliff outside. The silence in the room was absolute. No one ate. No one drank. Even the gossip columnists had stopped taking notes, stunned by the raw, naked grief of the woman they had labeled a gold digger. Roman Steele stood up, smoothing his jacket, a victorious smirk playing on his lips. He reached into his inner pocket, presumably for the papers, ready to finalize his coup. "Well," Roman said, his voice dripping with mock solemnity, "I think that is for the best. A wise decision, Paige. Better late than never." Paige turned to leave. She took one step, then two. She was reaching for the door handle of the atrium, ready to step out into the cold hallway and out of Aaron's life forever. "Stop." The word was not shouted. It was spoken at a normal volume, but it carried a weight that vibrated through the floorboards. It was deep, rough, and terrifyingly calm. It stopped Paige dead in her tracks. It wasn't Roman's voice. At the head of the table, Aaron Blackwood had finally moved. He had not stood up. He had simply placed his hand over the spinning ring on the table, stopping its movement. He was looking at his hand. Then, slowly, terrifyingly slowly, he lifted his head. He didn't look at Paige. He looked directly at Roman Steele. The air in the room changed instantly. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The broken man, the cuckolded husband, the passive victim, he was gone. In his place sat something else entirely. Something cold. Something dangerous. Something that had been waiting in the dark for a very, very long time. "Sit down, Paige," Aaron said. He didn't ask. He commanded. It was the voice of the architect, the man who ordered steel to bend and stone to fly. Paige froze, her hand hovering over the door handle. She looked back at him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Aaron stood up. He rose slowly, unfolding his height until he towered over the table. He picked up the ring Paige had discarded. He held it up to the light, inspecting it, before sliding it into his own pocket. "You think this is a collapse?" Aaron asked, his voice echoing off the glass walls. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the guests who had mocked him, his gaze sharp and dissecting. "You think you are watching a demolition?" He turned his body fully toward Roman. The predator's smile faltered on Roman's face for the first time that night. "You are mistaken," Aaron said, and a dark, predatory smile of his own touched the corners of his mouth. "You are not watching a demolition, Roman. You are watching a stress test. And the test is finished." The transformation of Aaron Blackwood was not sudden, though to the terrified guests in the room, it appeared as if a switch had been thrown. It was a gradual, terrifying recalibration of presence, like a dormant volcano shuddering back to life. He did not shout. He did not overturn the table. He simply ceased to be the passive object of their pity and became the architect of their fear. He stood at the head of the table, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned, revealing the lean, predatory lines of his torso. The air around him seemed to crackle with a static charge, a silent hum of violence that was far more intimidating than any physical threat. Roman Steele, who moments ago had been preening like a peacock in a garden he believed he owned, sank slightly in his chair. The smirk on his face faltered, twitching at the corners as he tried to process the shift in the room's gravity. He looked at Aaron, and for the first time that night, he did not see a broken man. He saw the cold, mathematical intelligence that had designed the tallest buildings in the Western Hemisphere. He saw a mind that viewed human beings as variables in an equation, and Roman suddenly realized he was no longer the constant. "A stress test," Roman repeated, his voice sounding thin and reedy in the cavernous silence. He tried to laugh, a dry, rattling sound that fooled no one. "You have had too much to drink, old friend. You are speaking in riddles. Sit down before you embarrass yourself further. Paige has already made the decision for you." Aaron moved. He did not walk toward Roman immediately. Instead, he walked slowly toward the window, the very spot where he had spent the last 3 hours in silence. The guests parted for him instantly, scrambling out of his path as if his touch might burn them. He stopped at the glass, staring out at the chaotic violence of the storm. The wind was battering the house with hurricane-force gusts, shaking the steel frame, but Aaron did not flinch. He placed a hand on the glass, feeling the vibration. "You all asked why I stood here," Aaron said, his voice low, vibrating with a timbre that resonated in the chest of every person in the room. He did not turn around. He spoke to the reflection of the room in the dark glass. "You whispered that I was ashamed. You whispered that I could not bear to look at my wife. You thought I was hiding." He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto the crowd. They were cold, hard, and devoid of mercy. But an architect does not hide from the storm. He watches it. He observes how the wind hits the sheer walls. He listens for the groan of the metal. He waits for the structure to settle. Aaron walked back toward the table, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He stopped behind the empty chair where Paige had been sitting. He gripped the back of the chair with both hands, leaning forward, his eyes boring into Roman. I was not hiding, Roman. I was counting. Counting what? Roman snapped, his composure beginning to fray. The millions you are losing? The minutes until your company collapses? Counting the lies, Aaron replied softly, and counting the seconds until midnight. He pulled a sleek, black smartphone from his pocket and placed it on the table. The screen lit up. It displayed a countdown timer. The guests watched the numbers tick down, hypnotized. Roman stared at the phone, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. He did not know what the timer meant, but the primal part of his brain, the part that sensed a predator in the tall grass, was screaming at him to run. You thought you were isolating me, Aaron continued, his voice rising slightly, gaining power. You thought that by feeding the press stories about my wife, by planting fake evidence of embezzlement on my servers, you were cutting off my support beams. You thought that if you made me look weak, the board would panic and hand you the keys to the kingdom. Aaron picked up the bottle of whiskey from the table. He poured a glass, not for himself, but for Roman. He slid it across the table. I do not know what you are talking about, Roman hissed, though his eyes darted nervously toward the door where two large men in suits, men who definitely were not waiters, had just quietly positioned themselves. This is slander. I have tried to save you, Aaron. I have covered for your mistakes. And this is how you repay me? With paranoid delusions? Aaron laughed. It was a dark, humorless sound. My mistakes? You mean the faulty steel? The room gasped. The words hung in the air like smoke. Paige, who had been frozen near the door, felt her knees buckle. He knew. He said the words. Faulty steel. She took a step forward, her hand covering her mouth. How did he know? She had protected that secret with her life. Aaron finally looked at her. For the first time all night, the mask of ice cracked, revealing a depth of emotion so raw and intense it almost brought her to her knees. It was not anger. It was not pity. It was a fierce, agonizing pride. You thought I was blind, Aaron said to her, his voice softening, though it lost none of its intensity. You thought I did not see the terror in your eyes every time he walked into a room? You thought I did not notice the way you checked the server logs at 3 a.m? You thought I believed for 1 second, one single second, that you would betray me for a man who builds strip malls and calls them legacy? Tears streamed down Paige's face. She shook her head, unable to speak. I knew, Aaron said, turning back to the room, his voice booming now, reclaiming his authority over every square inch of the estate. I knew the moment Roman approached you 3 months ago. I knew when he threatened to frame me. And I knew that you, my brilliant, foolish, noble wife, decided to destroy yourself to protect me. He pointed a finger at the crowd, accusing them, judging them. You looked at her and saw a cheater. I looked at her and saw a woman holding up the weight of the world. I saw a structural engineer taking on a load that should have crushed her just to keep the roof over my head. Then why? Paige choked out, her voice barely audible over the storm. Why did you let them treat me like this? Why didn't you say something? Because I needed him to feel safe, Aaron said, his eyes snapping back to Roman. I needed him to get arrogant. I needed him to think he had won, so that he would sign the final authorization papers for the takeover. I needed his signature on the document that proves he, not I, authorized the purchase of the substandard steel. Aaron tapped the table. And at 11:58 p.m., just before you tried to leave, my system notified me that the transfer was complete. Roman Steel is now the legal owner of the shell company that bought the bad steel. He just signed his own confession. Roman scrambled out of his chair, knocking it over. The crash echoed violently. He looked wild, cornered. You are lying. I signed nothing. My lawyers handle everything. Digital signatures are binding, Roman, Aaron said, taking a step closer, looming over the smaller man. especially when you use the access codes you stole from me. You thought you were logging into my accounts to frame me, but you were logging into a sandbox I built for you. A mirror server. You haven't been controlling my company for 3 months. You have been playing a video game, and you just lost. The silence that followed was total. The guests looked from Aaron to Roman, their mouths agape. The narrative they had been fed, the story of the weak husband and the cheating wife, had just been inverted. They were not watching a tragedy. They were watching an execution. Roman backed away, his face pale. This is entrapment. You can't prove any of this. It is just your word against mine. Aaron smiled. It was the smile of a wolf standing over a trapped lamb. My word? He asked. I am an architect, Roman. I do not deal in words. I deal in blueprints. I deal in hard data. And tonight, I am not just going to tell them what you did. Aaron reached into his pocket and pulled out a small remote control. He pointed it at the massive glass walls that surrounded them. I am going to show them. The lights in the room dimmed. The storm outside seemed to press closer, the lightning flashing in time with the thrumming tension in the room. Aaron stood in the center of the darkness, the only steady thing in a world spinning out of control. You wanted the room to judge me, Roman? Aaron whispered, his voice deadly calm. You wanted an audience? Fine. Let them look. Let them see the true face of the man who tried to tear down my house. He pressed the button. The darkness that descended upon the atrium was not the absence of light, but rather the sudden, terrifying clarity of truth. As Aaron pressed the button on the small remote, the floor-to-ceiling glass walls, which moments before had displayed the chaotic violence of the storm, instantly transformed. The technology of the cliffside glass house was not merely for aesthetic pleasure. It was a canvas, and tonight, Aaron Blackwood was painting a masterpiece of retribution. The glass panes turned opaque, blocking out the lightning and the rain. And in their place, high-definition video feeds flickered to life, surrounding the guests in a 360-degree theater of evidence. The first thing that filled the room was the sound. It was not the ambient jazz or the clinking of crystal that had defined the evening, but a voice. It was a voice every person in the room recognized, smooth, arrogant, and chillingly casual. It was the voice of Roman Steele, amplified by the surround sound system until it felt as though he were whispering directly into the ear of every guest. She will do it, or I will bury him. The recorded voice of Roman boomed. Aaron is too focused on the aesthetics. He does not check the supply chain invoices. I can swap the grade A steel for the cheap import stuff, pocket the difference, and he will never know until the building starts to sway. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. Roman, standing near the table, looked around wildly, his face draining of color as he saw his own face projected onto the massive north wall. It was surveillance footage from inside the company boardroom, dated 4 months ago. The resolution was crystal clear. It showed Roman leaning back in his chair, laughing as he explained his plan to a subordinate who was currently cowering in the corner of the gala. Turn it off. Roman screamed, his real voice cracking with panic. This is illegal. This is a deep fake. I never said that. But the house did not listen. The images shifted. The east wall lit up with a complex web of bank transfers. Lines of red light traced the path of millions of dollars, moving from the Obsidian Tower's construction budget into a shell company in the Cayman Islands. And there, glowing in undeniable neon blue at the end of the trail, was the name of the beneficiary, Steele Holdings LLC. Aaron stood in the center of this digital storm, illuminated by the cold light of the screens. He looked like a god of judgment, untouched by the chaos he had unleashed. He did not look at the screens. He knew every pixel by heart. He looked at the guests. He watched the realization wash over them, watched the sneers of judgment turn into the gaping mouths of horror. You called him a visionary, Aaron said, his voice cutting through the audio recording. He pointed at the image of Roman on the wall. You toasted his business acumen. You laughed when he mocked my company. Look at him. Look at the man who was willing to let 1,000 people die in a collapsing tower, just so he could buy a bigger yacht. The guests recoiled from Roman as if he were radioactive. The circle around him widened, leaving him isolated in the center of the room, stripped of his charm, stripped of his lies, exposed as the architect of a potential massacre. But Aaron was not finished. He pressed the button again. The bank records vanished. The video of the boardroom faded. In their place, a grainy, black and white video feed appeared on the central wall. It was a recording from a hidden camera, likely inside a car or a private office. The angle was low, hidden, desperate. The image showed Paige. She looked exhausted in the video, her eyes rimmed with red, her hands shaking. She was holding a file folder. Opposite her, Roman was smiling that predatory smile. "Please, Roman." The recorded voice of Paige begged, trembling with a fear that broke the hearts of everyone listening. "I have done everything you asked. I leaked the fake blueprints. I let the tabloids write those horrible things about me. I haven't told Aaron a single thing. Please, just give me the encryption key. If you delete the evidence of the steel fraud now, Aaron goes to prison for your crime." "Not yet, darling." The recorded Roman replied, reaching out to stroke her cheek on the screen, a gesture that made the real Paige in the room shudder violently. "I need you to break him a little more. I need him to be completely hopeless. When he signs the company over to me, then I will save him. Until then, you are my little secret weapon. Keep playing the whore, Paige. It suits you." The silence that followed this clip was heavier than the storm outside. It was a silence born of absolute, crushing shame. The guests who had spent the evening whispering about Paige's infidelity, who had called her a gold digger and a traitor, could not lift their heads. They realized, with sickening clarity, that they had been spectators to a martyrdom. They had watched a woman walk through fire for her husband, and they had thrown gasoline on the flames. Paige stood by the door, tears streaming down her face, but she did not wipe them away. She felt a strange lightness, as if the gravity in the room had shifted. The truth was out. The heavy cloak of the villain had been stripped from her shoulders, leaving her raw and exposed, but clean. Aaron walked toward her. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, ignoring Roman, ignoring the guests, ignoring the millions of dollars of evidence glowing on the walls. He only saw her. He stopped inches from where she stood, his body shielding her from the rest of the room. He reached out and took her hands, the hands that had removed her wedding ring only minutes before. His grip was crushing, desperate, possessing. He turned to face the room, keeping Paige's hand firmly in his. "You asked me why I did not speak," Aaron said, his voice rough with emotion. "You asked why I let the room judge me. I did not care about your judgment of me. I can withstand your scorn. I am built of stronger material than your opinions." He looked down at Paige, his eyes softening, filled with a mixture of reverence and apology. "But I had to wait. I had to wait until the evidence was undeniable. Because if I had moved 1 second too soon, if I had tipped my hand before Roman signed that transfer, he would have destroyed the servers, and he would have framed me. And Paige knew that." Aaron lifted her hand, raising it for everyone to see. It was not a gesture of triumph, but of honor. "You called her a cheater," Aaron declared, his voice rising, resonating off the glass walls. "You called her a traitor. You looked at the woman who saved my life, who saved my legacy, who saved the lives of every person who would have walked into that tower, and you called her a whore." He scanned the faces of the crowd, challenging them, shaming them. "Do not dare speak her name with disrespect ever again. She is not the woman who broke my home. She is the only reason it is still standing. She is the steel in the concrete. She is the shield that took the arrows you fired at me." He looked back at Roman, who was now leaning against the table, looking small and defeated. "I name her," Aaron said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper that carried to every corner of the room. "I name her the true architect of this family. And you, Roman? You are just the debris we are about to clear away." Paige looked up at her husband, her breath catching in her throat. She had waited months for this. She had waited through the lonely nights, through the humiliating headlines, through the agonizing dinners where he wouldn't look at her. She had thought she was alone, but he had seen her. He had understood. He had been building this moment, brick by brick, designing a sanctuary where her honor could be restored. "Aaron," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I have you," he murmured back, pulling her into his chest, wrapping his arms around her as if he intended to fuse their skeletons together. I have you, Paige. I never let go. Not for a second. The room remained frozen, caught in the aftershock of the revelation. The narrative had been shattered. The villain was the hero. The victim was the mastermind. And the man they thought was broken was the strongest force in the room. But the night was not over. Roman Steele, realizing that his reputation was incinerated and his freedom was measured in minutes, made a sound. A low, animalistic growl of desperation. He looked at the door. He looked at the windows. He looked at the woman who had tricked him and the man who had outsmarted him. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the cornered frenzy of a rat. You think this is over? Roman screamed, grabbing a steak knife from the table, his eyes wide and manic. You think you can just play a movie and send me to jail? I own this town. I own the police. I will burn this glass house to the ground with you inside it. Aaron did not flinch. He did not even let go of Paige. He simply looked at Roman with an expression of utter, cold boredom. Roman, Aaron said calm. Look at the south wall. Roman froze. He slowly turned his head. On the south wall, the video feed changed one last time. It showed the exterior of the cliffside glass house. Through the rain and the darkness, the flashing red and blue lights of a dozen federal vehicles were visible, winding their way up the driveway like a venomous snake coming to strike. I did not call the police, Aaron said softly. I called the FBI, and they have been watching this entire live stream since dinner began. The flashing blue lights of the federal convoy outside washed over the glass walls of the atrium, bathing the room in a rhythmic, strobing luminescence that made the terrified guests look like underwater statues. Roman Steele stood frozen, the steak knife trembling in his hand, a pitiful and archaic weapon against the technological and legal fortress Aaron Blackwood had constructed around him. The realization that he was not the hunter, but the prey, crashed down upon him with the weight of a collapsing roof. The arrogance that had fueled him for months, the belief that he was smarter, charming, and more ruthless than the silent architect, evaporated, leaving behind only the shivering, naked fear of a man facing the end of his life as he knew it. Aaron did not move to disarm him. He did not need to. He simply watched, his expression one of profound, clinical detachment, as if Roman were a being that had failed a stress test and now simply needed to be cleared from the site. The security detail, who had been posing as waiters topping off champagne glasses all evening, finally shed their camouflage. In a fluid, coordinated motion, 3 men in dark suits stepped out from the shadows, their badges glinting under the chaotic lights. Roman looked at them, then at the knife, and with a sob that was more sound than breath, he let the blade clatter onto the marble floor. The sound was sharp and final, marking the exact moment his ambition died. As the agents moved in to handcuff Roman, reciting his rights in a monotone drone that contrasted with the storm's fury outside, Paige felt the adrenaline drain from her body, leaving her knees weak. She leaned against Aaron, her anchor in the spinning world. But as the initial wave of relief receded, a new, sharper realization began to take root in her mind. She looked up at her husband's profile, sharp, stoic, and terrifyingly intelligent. You knew, she whispered, the words feeling heavy on her tongue. You said you knew from the beginning. But how? Roman had the encryption keys. He had the planted evidence on your private server. If you had tried to access it, he would have known. Aaron looked down at her, and for a moment, the guests and the police and the storm ceased to exist. He did have the keys, Aaron admitted, his voice low and vibrating with a complex mixture of regret and pride. But he made the mistake of thinking he was playing against a businessman. He forgot he was playing against an architect. I do not just design the facade, Paige. I design the infrastructure. He turned slightly to address the room, though his eyes remained fixed on the handcuffed Roman. 3 months ago, I noticed a discrepancy in the load calculations for the 42nd floor. It was minute, a variance of 0.05%. Most people would have called it a rounding error. But I do not allow errors in my buildings. Aaron walked closer to Roman, who was now being held by 2 agents. I traced the material batch numbers. I found the fraud immediately. I knew you were buying cheap steel and pocketing the difference. But I also knew that if I confronted you then, you would trigger the dead man's switch you had buried in my company server. You had enough fabricated evidence to send me to prison for 20 years for embezzlement. So you built a trap, Roman spat, his voice wet with tears and rage. You used her. You let me torture her for months just to save your own skin. The accusation hit the room like a physical blow. Paige flinched. It was the question that had been gnawing at her heart. If Aaron knew, why did he let her suffer? Why did he let her weep in the bathroom at night? Why did he let the world call her a whore? Aaron's face hardened, his jaw setting into a line of granite. I did not do it to save my skin, he said, his voice dropping to a terrifying chill. I did it to ensure you could never hurt anyone again. If I had fired you then, you would have leaked the files. I would have spent years in court clearing my name. The Obsidian Tower would have been halted, and you would have walked away with millions, free to run the same scam on another developer. I needed you to confess. I needed you to incriminate yourself so thoroughly that no lawyer on earth could save you. He gestured to the blackened screens on the wall. I built a mirror server, a digital clone of my company's internal network. When you thought you were hacking into my system to plant the evidence, you were actually logging into a sandbox I created for you. I watched you plant the files. I watched you create the fake invoices. I watched you draft the blackmail emails. Aaron paused, and his gaze shifted back to Paige. The coldness in his eyes melted, replaced by a raw, agonizing vulnerability that he had hidden for 90 days. But the trap had a cost. For you to believe you were winning, Roman, you had to believe my marriage was crumbling. You had to believe that Paige had turned against me. If I had shown her 1 ounce of comfort, if I had held her hand, if I had told her the truth, you would have sensed it. You are a predator. You smell weakness, but you also smell hope. I had to starve the room of hope so you would feel safe enough to strike. Paige stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. She realized the magnitude of what he was saying. He had not been ignoring her out of anger. He had been ignoring her out of discipline. He had watched her break apart piece by piece, day after day, and he had forced himself to do nothing, because saving her required him to be the villain in her story for a little while longer. It was a calculus of cruelty, a strategic sacrifice of their happiness to ensure their survival. It was the hardest thing I have ever done, Aaron whispered, his hand trembling slightly as he reached out to touch her face. Watching you cry in the guest bedroom, listening to you plead with him on the phone. Every instinct in my blood screamed at me to tear him apart with my bare hands. But I had to wait. I had to let the room judge me. I had to let them judge you. Because silence was the only weapon that could kill him. The guests stood in stunned silence, processing the layers of the scheme. They looked at Aaron not just with fear, but with a terrified awe. He had played a game of three-dimensional chess while they were playing checkers. He had endured the humiliation of the entire city, accepting the label of the cuckold, the fool, the failure, all to buy the time necessary to execute a perfect, surgical strike. You are a monster, Roman whispered, shaking his head as the agents began to drag him toward the door. You are cold. You have no heart. I have a heart, Aaron replied, pulling Paige against his side, his arm forming an unbreakable band of steel around her waist. And you are looking at the woman who holds it. I would burn this entire city to the ground to keep her safe. Sacrificing my reputation was a small price to pay. And sacrificing yours, Roman, that was a pleasure. As Roman was hauled out into the rain, screaming obscenities that were swallowed by the wind, the atmosphere in the room shifted from tension to a heavy, shameful reckoning. The guests, the investors, the critics, the friends who had turned their backs, suddenly found themselves standing in the wreckage of their own morality. They had been manipulated just as easily as Roman. They had believed the worst because it was entertaining. They had feasted on the scandal, and now, the bill had come due. Aaron turned his back on the door. He did not care about Roman anymore. Roman was a variable that had been solved and removed from the equation. He looked at the crowd. His expression was not triumphant. It was weary. He looked like a man who had held up the sky for too long and was finally allowing himself to feel the weight of it. The show is over, Aaron announced, his voice flat and dismissive. The dinner is finished. The police will need statements from some of you regarding what you witnessed. The rest of you, you know where the door is." He did not thank them for coming. He did not offer a polite farewell. He simply dismissed them, reducing the elite of Seattle to nothing more than unwanted noise. Paige felt a sudden surge of fierce, protective love for him. She understood now. The distance, the silence, the coldness, it was all a shield. He had built a fortress of solitude around them, not to keep her out, but to keep the enemy in the crosshairs. He had let himself be hated so that she could be vindicated. "Aaron," she whispered, grabbing his lapel. "The mirror server. Did you really watch everything?" "Everything," he confirmed, his eyes searching hers. "I saw you defend me when he tried to mock me. I saw you refuse his advances. I saw you trying to find a way to save the tower without implicating me. I saw your loyalty, Paige. It is the most beautiful structure I have ever seen. It is the only thing in this world that is truly unbreakable." The tears came again, but this time they were not born of despair. They were the release of a pressure that had been building for months. The structural integrity of their marriage had been tested by a force that would have shattered lesser foundations, and it had held. It had groaned, it had cracked, but it had held. "Take me home," she said softly, ignoring the fact that they were already in their house. "Please, just take me home. Soon," Aaron promised, kissing her forehead. "But first, we have one last thing to do. We have to clear the rubble." The removal of Roman steel from the cliffside glass house was not the dignified exit of a fallen titan, but the messy, chaotic extraction of a parasite that had burrowed too deep into the host. The FBI agents did not handle him with the reverence the Seattle elite usually commanded. To them, he was not a real estate mogul or a philanthropist. He was a suspect in a federal wire fraud case, a man who had gambled with human lives for profit. They gripped his arms with professional indifference, their fingers digging into the fabric of his midnight blue tuxedo, wrinkling the silk that he had worn like a suit of armor only hours before. Roman's feet skidded against the polished marble floor as he tried to dig his heels in, fighting against the inevitable momentum of justice. The composure he had maintained for years, the shark-like grin, the easy charm, the languid confidence, had completely disintegrated. In its place was a feral, panicked desperation. He twisted his head back, his eyes searching the room for anyone who might intervene, anyone who might still believe the narrative he had spun. "Call my attorney," Roman screamed, his voice cracking, stripping the vocal cords raw. "You cannot do this. Do you know who I am? I am Roman Steele. I built half this city. I own the mayor. This is a mistake. This is a setup." The guests, however, did not move. The people who had laughed at his jokes 20 minutes ago, who had toasted to his hostile takeover, now looked at him with the detached horror of drivers passing a fatal car accident. They saw the desperation in his eyes, and it repulsed them. In their world, the only sin greater than failure was the loss of control, and Roman was unraveling in spectacular fashion. Aaron Blackwood watched the spectacle from the center of the room, his arms still wrapped protectively around Paige. He did not look angry. He did not look triumphant. He looked like a building inspector surveying a structure that had finally been condemned. There was a cold, clinical finality in his gaze. "Wait," Aaron said. The single word cut through Roman's screaming and the agent's commands. It was not shouted, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. The agents paused near the heavy oak doors, looking back at the owner of the house. Roman slumped slightly in their grip, mistaking the pause for mercy. He looked at Aaron, his chest heaving, a flicker of pathetic hope igniting in his eyes. "Aaron," Roman gasped, sweat dripping down his forehead to mix with the tears of rage. "Aaron, listen to me. We can fix this. I can explain. It was just business. You understand business. Do not let them take me. We are partners." Aaron gently released Paige, stepping away from her warmth to walk toward the door. He moved with the slow, inevitable pressure of a glacier. He stopped 3 feet from Roman, close enough to see the broken capillaries in the other man's eyes, close enough to smell the fear radiating off him. "We are not partners," Aaron said softly. "We have not been partners since the day you decided that my wife was a leverage point instead of a human being. I can pay you back, Roman pleaded, the words tumbling out in a rush. The 12 million? I will wire it back tomorrow. I will give you double. I have assets, Aaron. I have the penthouse, the yacht, the holdings in Dubai. I can make this go away. You always thought architecture was about the decoration. You thought it was about the gold leaf and the marble facade. You never understood that the value is in the foundation. And yours? Yours is gone. Aaron reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was not a legal document, but a simple printout of a bank confirmation. He held it up for Roman to see. You mentioned your assets, Aaron continued, his voice calm and conversational. But you seem to have forgotten the terms of our original partnership agreement for the Obsidian Tower. Clause 14, Section B. The bad faith clause. It stipulates that in the event of proven fraud or embezzlement by either managing partner, all assets leveraged against the project are immediately liquidated to cover the liability. Roman's eyes widened, the white showing all around the irises. No, he whispered. No, you could not. The moment you signed that transfer tonight, the one you thought was stealing my company, you triggered the clause, Aaron explained, his voice devoid of mercy. My lawyers filed the motion 3 minutes ago. Your accounts have been frozen. Your penthouse is now the property of the bank. Your yacht has been seized at the marina. Even the car you drove here tonight is currently being towed from my driveway. Aaron leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that only Roman could hear. You do not have the money to hire a lawyer, Roman. You do not even have the money to pay for a taxi ride home. You are not just going to prison. You are going as a pauper. The color drained from Roman's face so completely that he looked like a corpse. The fight went out of him. His body went limp in the agent's arms, the reality of his total annihilation finally piercing the delusion of his ego. He had lost everything, not just his freedom, but his identity. He was no longer Roman Steele, the billionaire developer. He was a statistic. He was a cautionary tale. Get him out of my house, Aaron commanded, turning his back on his former friend. He is cluttering the design. The agents hauled Roman out into the storm. The heavy doors opened, admitting a blast of freezing wind and rain that swirled into the atrium, cleansing the stale air of the party. Roman did not scream this time. He was dragged into the darkness, a broken man dissolving into the night, swallowed by the very chaos he had tried to inflict on others. The doors slammed shut with a final, resonant boom that echoed off the glass walls. The silence that returned to the room was heavy, but it was different now. It was not the silence of judgment that had suffocated Paige earlier in the evening. It was the silence of awe and terror. The guests stood amidst their half-eaten dinners and unfinished drinks, looking at Aaron Blackwood with a newfound respect that bordered on fear. They realized they were in the presence of a man who played the long game with terrifying precision. They had mistaken his silence for weakness, when in reality, it was the stillness of a predator waiting for the perfect angle of attack. Aaron stood by the door for a moment, composing himself. He adjusted his cuffs, smoothing the fabric of his jacket. Then, he turned to face the room. He did not smile. He did not look relieved. He looked tired, but unbroken. The gala is over, Aaron announced. His voice was flat, carrying a note of dismissal that made it clear he had no patience left for social pleasantries. My staff will bring your coats. The valet has brought your cars around. Please leave. It was a breach of etiquette that would have been unthinkable in normal circumstances. A host kicking out his guests before dessert was even served. But no one argued. No one lingered to make small talk. The atmosphere in the room was too charged, too dangerous. They scrambled to leave, muttering quiet apologies, avoiding eye contact with Paige, clutching their purses and phones as if afraid Aaron might liquidate their assets too if they stayed too long. Paige watched them go. She saw the same people who had sneered at her now looking at the floor, ashamed to meet her gaze. She saw the gossip columnist who had called her a traitor hurrying out the door, her notebook tucked deep inside her bag. It was a vindication, yes, but Paige felt no joy in it. She only felt a profound exhaustion. The adrenaline that had sustained her for 3 months was fading, leaving behind the ache of the trauma she had endured. She walked over to Aaron. The room was emptying fast, the servants moving silently to clear the tables, their eyes wide as they glanced at their employer. Aaron was standing by the window again, looking out at the red taillights of the police convoy fading into the distance. He looked solitary, a monolith against the storm. Paige reached out and touched his arm. His muscles were rock hard, tense with the residual stress of the confrontation. "They are gone," she whispered. "All of them. The police. The guests. Roman. They are all gone, Aaron." Aaron turned to her. The mask finally dropped completely. His shoulders slumped, and he let out a long, shuddering breath that seemed to carry the weight of the last 90 days. He looked at Paige, his eyes tracing the lines of her face as if memorizing her all over again. He saw the fatigue in her eyes, the paleness of her skin, the shadow of the pain he had allowed her to suffer. "I hated it," he said, his voice rough and breaking. "Every second of it. I hated listening to them talk about you. I hated seeing you walk around this house like a ghost. I wanted to tell you so many times, Paige. I almost broke the plan a dozen times just to see you smile." "But you didn't," Paige said, stepping closer, resting her head against his chest. She could hear his heart beating, steady, strong, rhythmic. "You held the line. You were the load-bearing wall, Aaron. If you had broken, we both would have been buried." "I was terrified," he admitted, wrapping his arms around her, burying his face in her hair. "I can calculate the stress on a steel beam. I can predict how glass will shatter. But I could not predict you. I was terrified that I would push you too far, that you would leave before I could spring the trap, that you would stop loving me because I was too cold." Paige pulled back slightly to look at him. She reached up and placed her hands on his cheeks, feeling the warmth of his skin, the reality of him. "I almost did," she confessed softly. "Tonight, when I took off the ring, I thought it was over. I thought you had let the room judge me and found me wanting." "I was never judging you," Aaron swore, pressing his forehead against hers. "I was letting them judge themselves. And tonight, the verdict was delivered." He took a deep breath, the smell of her perfume grounding him, pulling him back from the edge of the precipice he had been walking. "But the cost was too high. Look at us. We won, but we are standing in wreckage. I need to know, Paige, can we rebuild this? Or did I let the demolition go too far?" Paige looked around the empty atrium. The screens were dark again. The tables were cluttered with the debris of the party. The storm was still raging outside, but inside, it was quiet. She looked back at her husband, the architect who had destroyed everything to save her. "The foundation is still there," she whispered, taking his hand and placing it over her heart. "And as long as the foundation is good, we can build anything." The silence that followed the departure of the last police cruiser was heavy, absolute, and strangely physical. It settled over the cliffside glass house like dust after a demolition, coating the empty champagne glasses and the abandoned silk napkins in a layer of stillness. The storm outside had finally broken, the violent gale reducing itself to a steady, rhythmic weeping of rain against the darker panes of glass. Inside, the house felt vast and hollow, stripped of the artificial noise of the gala, leaving only the breathing of two people who had survived a war fought in whispers. Aaron dismissed the catering staff with a generous bonus and a quiet order for absolute discretion. Within 20 minutes, the house was empty. The lights in the atrium were dimmed to a soft, amber glow, casting long shadows across the marble floor where Roman steel had been dragged away. Paige sat on the edge of the long glass dining table, her legs dangling, her white dress pulled around her like the petals of a wilted flower. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the terror of the confrontation had evaporated, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that made her hands tremble. She watched Aaron. He was walking around the room, systematically turning off the wall screens that had displayed the evidence of their victory. One by one, the blue glow of bank transfers and the grainy footage of betrayal vanished, returning the walls to simple, transparent glass. He was erasing the crime scene. He was dismantling the theater he had built. When the last screen went dark, he stopped and loosened his tie, pulling the strip of black silk from his collar and dropping it onto a chair. It was the first uncalculated movement he had made all night. He walked over to her, his footsteps echoing softly. He did not say a word. He simply stepped between her knees and wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face in the curve of her neck. He breathed her in, a long, shuddering inhalation that spoke of a desperate hunger for her presence. Paige closed her eyes, her hands finding their way into his hair, gripping him tightly. They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other in the wreckage of the evening, grounding themselves in the physical reality that they were both still there, still standing, still them. "I am sorry," Aaron whispered against her skin. His voice was rough, stripped of the commanding baritone he had used to destroy Roman. It was the voice of the man she had married, vulnerable and tired. "I am sorry I had to be the architect of your pain." "You were not," Paige replied, pulling back slightly so she could look into his eyes. They were dark, rimmed with the shadows of sleepless nights. "You were the safety net. I just did not know it." "I hated the design," Aaron admitted, running his thumb over her cheekbone, tracing the path where her tears had fallen earlier. "Every day for 3 months, I had to wake up and put on a mask. I had to look at you, the woman who is the very foundation of my life, and treat you like a stranger. I had to let them gossip. I had to let Roman touch your arm. Do you know how much restraint it took not to break his hand when he touched you tonight?" "I saw your hand," Paige said softly, "on the whiskey glass. You were squeezing it so hard I thought it would shatter." "I wanted to shatter everything," Aaron said, "but I could not. I had to wait for the load to transfer. If I had moved too soon, the structure would have failed." He sighed and stepped back, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out the platinum ring she had discarded on the table hours ago. The diamond caught the low light, sparkling with a cold, hard brilliance. Aaron held it up, inspecting it, turning it over in his fingers. "You took this off," he said quietly. It was not an accusation. It was an observation of a structural fact. "I thought I had to," Paige confessed, looking at the ring. "I thought I was the weak link. I thought that by staying, I was only giving Roman more leverage to hurt you. I wanted to release the pressure." "You are not the weak link, Paige. You are the keystone," Aaron said, taking her left hand. His skin was warm against hers. "Do you know what a keystone is? It is the central stone at the summit of an arch, locking the whole together. If you remove it, the arch collapses. You tried to remove yourself to save the building, but you did not realize that without you, there is no building. There is just a pile of rocks." He did not slide the ring back on immediately. He held it at the tip of her finger, his eyes locking with hers. "I cannot give you back the last 3 months. I cannot erase the things they said about you. The cracks are there." We both felt the tremors. "We can patch the cracks," Paige whispered. "No." Aaron shook his head slowly. "We do not patch. Patching is for amateurs. It hides the damage but does not fix the integrity." He slid the ring slowly down her finger, past the knuckle, until it rested once again at the base of her hand. It felt heavier now, weighted with the history of the night. "We reinforce. We build new supports around the scars. We make the broken places stronger than they were before. That is what great architecture is. It is not about perfection. It is about resilience." Paige looked down at her hand. The ring looked different now. It was no longer just a symbol of their wedding vows. It was a service medal. Aaron laid her down on the bed, removing her shoes with a tenderness that made her throat ache. He lay down beside her, not touching her sexually, but pulling her against him, covering them both with the heavy duvet. They lay in the darkness, watching the gray light seep through the windows. The house was silent around them, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was not the silence of secrets or the silence of judgment. It was the peaceful, settled silence of a structure that has weathered the hurricane and is resting in the calm aftermath. "What happens tomorrow?" Paige asked, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes closing. "Tomorrow," Aaron said, his arm tightening around her. "The lawyers will handle the debris. The press will rewrite their stories. The board will beg for forgiveness." He kissed the top of her head. "But none of that matters. Tomorrow, we start the renovation. Just you and me. We check the foundation. We pour new concrete. And we do not let anyone else inside the walls." "No more glass houses," Paige murmured, sleep pulling her under. "No," Aaron agreed, watching the sun begin to crest over the horizon, illuminating the unbreakable steel frame of his home. From now on, we build a fortress. As Paige finally drifted into a dreamless sleep, safe in the arms of the man who had orchestrated the world to save her, Aaron Blackwood kept his eyes open. He watched the sunrise. He watched the light hit the water. He was an architect, and he knew that the most important part of any project was not the ribbon-cutting ceremony or the applause of the crowd. It was the morning after the storm, when you walked through the site, inspected the damage, and realized that despite everything, the house was still standing. They say that the truth always comes out in the end, but as we saw with Aaron and Roman, sometimes you have to build a trap to catch it. This story is a brutal but beautiful reminder that arrogance is a heavy weight, and eventually, it will collapse the structure of any lie. Roman still thought he was the player, but he was just a piece on the board. It inspires us to be patient, to be observant, and to never mistake someone's silence for weakness. Real strength isn't loud. It's calculated, it's enduring, and it protects what is precious at all costs. Now it is your turn. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to stay silent while others misunderstood you, just to win in the end? Share your experience in the comments. And don't forget to tell us which city or state you are representing in the comment section. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this dramatic turnaround, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a new upload. There is another incredible story waiting for you on the screen right now. Go ahead and click it. Thanks for watching.